too, I'm sure. Come on. Ooh, I don't know. It might be a big walleye. So we just slid up on the top of this little hump that's got weeds coming up maybe 4 or 5 feet up. Saw a big old mark suspended over the top of them. That old trusty 3/16 ounce jig and a crawler on, and I wasn't sure if it was going to be a northern or like a 5-pound largemouth. But we got the right species, boys. It was so cool that it was cruising up on top of that little hump, and there's a big cloud of bait fish, and he's just up there pushing bait fish around. And man, they don't always commit, but I busted out the my dirty little trick. Little 3/16 ounce VMC Ned Rig Jig with a half a crawler. And big suspended overs cannot resist it. Look at that thing, she's pretty. Just thumped it too. So why the jig? Why just a goofy, simple little jig and a crawler? Versatility. I know a lot of people would argue like slip bobber and live scope, how do you beat that? Well, slip bobber, you constantly have to adjust your depth. And sometimes they're 5 feet down over 10 feet of water. Sometimes you're fishing a spot, you look over your shoulder and there's a fish 12 feet down over 30 feet of water. You never know where they're gonna be at in the water column. The jig just lets you get down to where it's at and get it in front of their face. It's another reason I like using as light as I can get away with. 3/16, I can still cast it 40 to 70 feet depending on the wind, but it's light enough that when I close that bail, and you got that line floating on the surface, it like creates a lift and keeps that bait pretty vertical. You can kind of fish it in one spot for a long time. And we were talking about this the other day. Drop shots notoriously catch a bunch of small fish if we're using night crawlers. Put the same half of a night crawler on a jig, we get nicer fish. It is unbelievable how many big walleyes are always suspended. And it doesn't matter if it's in 10 feet of water, they're 2-3 feet off the bottom, I'd still consider that suspended. Or they're maybe 10 feet off bottom. There's the fish, big old suspended mark, and you can see how far the shadow is. So that fish is suspended up off bottom. So big it's probably a northern, or it's a 34-inch walleye. But it seems like every time that we catch one of those fish that we see on the screen and it's up off bottom, it's almost always an over, which is a walleye over 20 inches, our slot limit in Minnesota. And they're just always big fish. And so our local walleye league, we always have to have this little number ready, no matter what we're doing. Even if we're crushing fish, throwing a drop shot or on a jigging wrap or whatever, you have to have this ready, because I cannot tell you how many times, even if we're catching a bunch of fish doing a different technique, you flip around, look on the live scope, look at this. There's a suspended fish right there. I'm just gonna try wiggling and jiggling above his head a little bit. A little poppy. Probably won't bite because that would be too good at timing. But you just never know when you're going to turn around and there's going to be a random big mark suspended. And so the crazy thing is, we fish a lot of the same spots that we always have fished, that we fished for 20 years before we ever had LiveScope or whatever. And we'll go to those same spots. But what we didn't know is, for all those years, back over our shoulder, 30 to 50 feet behind us, were the biggest walleyes in the lake suspended off bottom. So a lot of the times we're just going to go to that best piece of structure, that deep hump, you know, edge of a weed flat, a point with wind blowing on it, whatever it is. But you know, just off of the break, suspended over the deep water, is where those big fish are. And it's so crazy how in our local league, you know, we'll be pitching to 16 to 18 feet of water with a drop shot trying to catch our unders, and you got one guy who's looking over your shoulder. You just constantly have to stop, And every once in a while scan and look back over and just see, because you'll look back and there'll be 3 big blobs out in the middle of nowhere that you would never know were there before this. So this one, I was working it real slow in front of his face, and he would come up, come down, just kind of look at it, and then I actually did a couple of big like pops, and then he just flew in and crushed it. It was so funny. We're like, he's just not interested, and I just did like a pop, and then you saw that mark just close the gap and crush it. Just a decent over. I mean, really, it's a really good fish, especially for this lake. But when you're targeting those, whoa, she's mad. Oh my gosh, you can't even see it, and I set the hook instantly. But when you're targeting those big suspended marks, this is about as small of a walleye as you'll catch. It is so addicting, and I know for a fact that there's a lot of pros who will just drive around with their trolling motor, scanning left, right, and all they're doing is driving around looking for those big suspended fish, casting at them, reading the mood of it, and trying to figure out if they want to move on to the next one or keep harassing that fish. And I don't think there's a better way right now to catch big fish, even on an average lake like this one, than targeting those suspended fish that are off structure that have never seen a bait until the invention of forward-facing sonar. What's crazy is how well that collar holds them on. I don't even understand it. You can have a bluegill come and be pecking at the bait, and they will pull the tail off of there before, I mean, look at that. It's literally, it's tearing the crawler before it even slides off of that hook shank, which is insane. And I don't even really understand it because it's just that little collar. Bugger was suspended about 5 feet off bottom, but only in like 10 feet of water, right off of a weed edge. And the old jig and crawler does it again. Just had to flip around for the wind noise here, but that one was about 5 feet off bottom, only in 10 feet of water, just suspended right off the weed edge. Pitched the old jig and a nightcrawler at him, and whammy. And I'm throwing this on the Elliott Identity rig and jig. So far, it is my favorite rod out of the new Identity lineup. It's a 7.4 medium light. I talked about it a little bit in a video before, but it's just like butter. It's the only way I know how to describe it. It's so smooth and balanced, and it is perfect for chucking these little 1/8 ounce or so 3/16 ounce jigs. And that fast action, just kind of loading up and then leaning into those fish, giving them a second to munch on that jig. Just kind of like a double munch to make sure that they got it and didn't just nip at the back. And I'm running 8-pound Sufix Advance braid and about a 10-foot leader of 8-pound fluorocarbon. And this is where it used to be like, okay, I always have a jigging wrap next to my throttle. And this is another one of those rods where I always have one rigged up, because anytime I'm doing anything, whether it's fishing up in shallow or out deep, if I see a big suspended fish, I want this thing ready to rip. So it's like I'm starting to get, it's funny, ever since getting LiveScope, Now I have more rods on the deck. You used to have your 2 or 3, and it's like if they're not gonna eat this, they'll eat that. And if they don't eat either of those, then you're good. But now with LiveScope and seeing how many fish are around, I just keep getting more and more rods because I'm constantly cycling through baits, trying to figure out what can make them eat. You realize there's way more fish around you than you ever thought possible, but this little number has probably put more big fish in my boat the last 2 or 3 years than everything combined. And it's not glamorous, it's not the coolest thing. Would I rather catch them snapping a plastic or a glide bait? Of course, and some days they do, but when they don't and you need to get bit, I guarantee you there's a lot more people throwing just a little jig and a half a crawler at these suspended fish than are ever willing to actually admit and tell you that they're doing it. Oh, I wanted to push off so bad right there. That is the meanest dang walleye I have ever caught in my life. Oh, I love her. She's mean, but I like her.